This
Kentucky.
conference will now be recorded.
Tonight's story is about two people from Kentucky, both of whom you knew, but I don't know that you knew how closely associated they were throughout most of their lives. In 1808, Jefferson Davis was born in a little town in southwestern Kentucky. And what you see on the left is the Jefferson Davis Monument, second only to the Washington Monument in the United States in height. 7 months later, Abraham Lincoln was born about 125 miles away, also in a very small town in Kentucky. And what you see on the right is the Lincoln Memorial that's at that town. It's not exactly the same as the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. Inside is a replica of the house that he was born in. I'm going to talk about the presidents of the Civil War, Abraham and Jefferson. Lincoln achieved a mantle that I think probably surpasses any other American, and it continues to grow over the years. But Jefferson Davis was chosen almost against his will. He did not want to be the president of the Confederacy. His mantle, after 150 years, is substantially less than Abraham Lincoln's. I think of the Civil War as an American tragedy. Both of these men were combinations of Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear in the great American tragedy. Now, the purpose of this presentation is to help clear away some of the cobwebs in our myths about these two men. First, Abraham Lincoln. He was the 16th president of the United States, March of '61, until he was assassinated on Good Friday in 1865. He was a country lawyer. He was not a very well-educated man. He spent some time in the Illinois state legislature, and he was a one-term member of the United States House of Representatives. He tried to run for Senate somewhere later in the process and lost to Stephen Douglas. He was an outspoken opponent of the expansion of slavery, and that is different than just being an opponent of slavery. What he said was, keep it where it is. Do not let it expand into the west of this country. And that's one of the reasons that he achieved the kind of support that he achieved. He was a very good speaker. He was nominated at the Republican convention in 1860 and elected president. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how he got elected. It's a bit surprising as a story. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That freed the slaves in what was controlled by the Confederacy, but not all other slaves. Not only that, he did not consider that that would stand after the war ended because it was a war act. He also promoted the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And any of you have seen Spielberg's movie on Lincoln, that's about the 13th Amendment. It's a very interesting story. He died a martyr to his cause. Jefferson Davis was the leader of the Confederacy during the war. He was its only president. His namesake was Thomas Jefferson. He graduated from the military academy in 1828. He was a year older than Robert E. Lee. He stayed in the Army the first time for 7 years, resigning his commission in 1835. When the war with Mexico started, he rejoined the army. He fought in the Mexican-American War as a colonel of the volunteer regiment and later was Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. As a senator, he argued against secession, but he did agree that each state was sovereign and had the right to secede. So he was not for secession, but he also was not against it and in legal concept as Lincoln was. Lincoln never agreed that the states actually had the right to secede from the United States. He did not treat them in that fashion. His presidential term of office ended badly. He tried to escape after Richmond fell. He was captured by Union forces and he spent 2 years in Fort Monroe in Virginia awaiting trial. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the United States in 1860. And if you look at the colored map up on the right, you see that there were 3 different kinds of states. There were free states, slave states, and then border states. In the border states, slavery was legal. This is what Lincoln saw. It was an experiment in democracy. There was no other democracy in the world when the United States was formed. It was less than 30 years old when the 2 of them were born in 1808 and 1809. During the War of 1812, which happened after they were born, the United States was badly beaten by the British. We won the Battle of New Orleans, but we lost the War of 1812. In fact, many of the founding fathers, including Jefferson and Adams, were still alive when Lincoln and Davis were young men. They did not die until the 1820s. The major issue in 1860 America was slavery. In hindsight, the other major issue was tariffs, but it was nothing compared to slavery. People felt, and Lincoln was one of them, that if he let the South leave, the American experiment would probably fail. It would prove that the concept of uniting this kind of a diverse population could not be done. So that's where we were in 1860. And I want to tell you a little bit about slavery because of its significance. And if you look at the graph on the bottom right, most people, and I say most people who owned slaves at all, owned only 5, 9, 2, 1. They did not own very many slaves. About 2,000 people owned 100 or more slaves. Those were the large plantations. So for the most part, slaves were sprinkled around among a fairly large percentage of the Southern population, but they were not major slave owners. The Constitution did not restrict slavery. And if you read into the Constitution, the founding fathers were afraid that that would divide the country into 2 countries, one slave and one non-slave, and so they just did not address it. By 1830, there were 2 million slaves in the United States. By 1860, and that's the time of the war, there were 4 million slaves, almost all in the southern states. But remember, some of them were also in the border states. We started abolishing slavery in the North in the early 19th century, but the struggle over slavery continued as new states came into the Union. And if you read very much about Kansas, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision and all of that, what it basically said was we were not, at that point in time, as a country, ready to constrict slavery to the slave states. In reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in 1850, the Republican Party was formed. It did not exist prior to that. A lot of it came from the Whig Party, but it also came from the abolitionists, and the Republican Party from the very beginning had as its main platform opposition to the spread of slavery. Now, talk a little bit about the early life of Abraham Lincoln. He was born February 12, 1809. Abraham Lincoln experienced more death in his family than most of us can imagine. His first experience with death of a family member was when his younger brother died in childbirth. Then his mother died when he was 9. So 2 intimate family members had died before he was the age of 9. He attended school very sporadically, perhaps for a total of 1 year. He learned what he needed from books and experience. Then when he was 19, his older sister died in childbirth. And these deaths did not stop with the death of family members, but they established a pattern of loss that would haunt him the rest of his life. His life was shrouded in a mixture of sadness, melancholy, and depression. And when we think of a person who has those kinds of emotional problems, we don't think of a person who accomplished what Abraham Lincoln accomplished.
George,
Sir,
can you go back to the picture before about? It said when Lincoln was 19, his older sister died in childbirth. I don't know. How do you figure that?
his older sister was married to another man, and she was about to have a baby when he was 19. He was not the oldest member of his family.
Okay.
He was 19. His older sister, who was having a baby, died in childbirth.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. First, he met someone named Anne Rutledge. However, and she lived in this little village outside of Springfield, where Lincoln first started doing the work that he was doing. She contracted typhoid fever and she died. Lincoln then went into a deep depression. Later on, I'm going to tell you that Jefferson Davis also lost his first love. Then Lincoln met a woman named Mary Todd. That was the woman that he married. She was young, she was handsome, she was witty, she was cultured. She was very different from the awkward Abraham Lincoln. In 1840, they were engaged. Lincoln was not overly enthusiastic about being married. In fact, at one time, he actually broke his engagement to her. He viewed marriage as something indescribably horrible and alarming. He was not a happy person that he was marrying her. And if you ask, why did he marry her? I don't know. Getting ready now for the ceremony, he was asked where he was going. His answer was, I guess I'm going to hell. He was married in 1842 at 33 years of age. He had a first son named Robert. Robert was the son that you see in the movies who joined the Union Army during the war. Robert lived a long life and was very successful. His second son, whose name is Edward, was born in 1846. 3 years later, that son died also. 10 months later, in 1850, he had a third son. His name was William, also known as Willie. And that's the son who died in the White House. His death was just another terrible blow. Lincoln was forever beset by death in his family. In 1853, his fourth son, Thomas, also called Tad, was born. He survived his father, but he died at the age of 18, 6 years after the war. So Lincoln's life was just one ongoing crisis after another, with family members dying. Early life of Jefferson Davis. Davis was born in 1809. He was the youngest of 10 children. And those of you who have children pecking order kinds of experiences, it's very unlikely that the youngest of any group that big is going to accomplish what Davis accomplished. His family were farmers, but his father prospered. He acquired land and then slaves, and his father then became a man of some significance. He first went to Jefferson College in Washington, Mississippi. Then he went to Transylvania University at Lexington, Kentucky. Then he went to the United States Military Academy. He entered the academy in 1824. So he was a bit better educated than Abraham Lincoln, and that's an understatement. In June of 1828, he graduated 23rd in the class of 33. He was 1 year ahead of Robert E. Lee. He served in the Army as a lieutenant from 1828 until 1835, and that's a long time to be a lieutenant, and he left the service. Among his classmates and associates, and we've talked about this before, were people who achieved fame in the Confederate Army: Albert Sidney Johnston, Lee, Leonidas Polk, Joseph Johnson, and John Magruder were all known to him when he was at the military academy. He served in something called the Black Hawk War, and Lincoln also served in the Black Hawk War, by the way. His experiences there were no more memorable than Lincoln's. Basically, Black Hawk was a rebellion, I believe, in the northern part of the Midwest. The United States sent forces up there to constrain the Black Hawks. There was anticipated fighting, but it never materialized. During this period, now back to Davis, he was suffering bouts of melancholia. I don't know exactly what you would call people who have melancholia today, but in this regard, he was very much like Lincoln. In 1835, he resigned his commission. He married the daughter of Zachary Taylor, and I'm not sure what Zachary Taylor's position was in 1835. I think he was a prominent person, but he married him against his wishes, and then on their honeymoon, both of them contracted malaria, and his wife died. In 1844, he married a woman named Varina Howell. She was 18 years his junior. So if you do the math, he was 36 and she was 18. They had 6 children, 2 of which were actually born during the Civil War. So he found some time during the Civil War for some extracurricular activities. In 1845, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Mississippi. His next 20 years would be primarily focused on public life. During the Mexican-American War, they raised a group called the Mississippi Rifles. Davis, who was a civilian at the time, was elected its colonel. He developed a good relationship with his Army commander, Zachary Taylor, and it would seem to me that Zachary Taylor would have been his father-in-law had his first wife lived. However, Taylor took a liking to Davis sometime after the original problems that he had with him, and he ensured that Davis was placed in an advantageous situation. Now, Davis and the United States government Because of his war service, the governor of Mississippi appointed him to fill a Senate term of a senator who had deceased. So he entered the U.S. Senate in 1847. In 1852, still a senator, he supported Franklin Pierce for president. Pierce won the presidency, and he made Davis his Secretary of War. Davis at that time was very, very highly thought of in the Washington crowd. In 1855, he led the effort to expand the Army. They created 4 new cavalry regiments. One of them went to a friend of his, Albert Sidney Johnston, whose second in command was Robert E. Lee. That regiment was formed in Texas. His term as Secretary of War ended with Pierce in 56. Then he ran again for the Senate. He reclaimed his Senate seat in 1857. On July 4th, 1858, he actually delivered an anti-secession speech at Faneuil Hall in Boston. He urged the preservation of the Union. Based on his experience as Secretary of War, he did not believe the South had the military or naval resources necessary to defend itself if war were to break out. He was not in favor of secession. Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. I have a book, and any of you are welcome to read it if you're interested. It is all of the newspaper clippings from that era. And it's really interesting to read about what was going on in our country prior to the election, during the election, and after the election. All of the various activities. But the country was in turmoil. We think we have turmoil today. We have no idea what that looks like. First, they had a Democratic convention. The first Democratic convention did not nominate anybody. They could not agree on who they wanted for a candidate. Then they held a second Democratic convention, and they nominated Stephen Douglas. Then the Southern Democrats, which is why they had the first problem, nominated an incumbent vice president, John C. Breckinridge, for president. So you can see you have multiple people splitting the Democratic vote. There were also 4 contenders for the Republican nomination. The 2 primary ones were Seward and Chase. Seward was a governor, and I think Chase was a governor also. Now remember, at that point in time, Lincoln was just a lawyer. He had no position whatsoever in the government. However, Lincoln became a compromise candidate because both Seward and Chase, and to a lesser degree Bates, were so strongly against slavery that they were afraid, they being the Republicans, were afraid they would not be able to get any votes outside of their constituencies. They chose Lincoln as a compromise. On the 3rd ballot, enough delegates shifted to Lincoln to secure his nomination as the Republican candidate. He won an electoral majority in the United States without anything remotely resembling a popular majority. He won 180 electoral votes, but only 39% of the popular vote. Breckinridge, remember him back up above, as a Southern Democrat, had 72 electoral votes. Stephen Douglas, who was the other major name on the ticket, only won, I think, 2 or 3 states. It was a strange election, to put it mildly. Lincoln won without having any votes. He wasn't even on the ballot in the southern states.
Who was John Bell, George?
John Bell was another either Democrat or, I guess, Democrat. I don't remember what his specific.
Wasn't he from Kentucky?
He might have been.
I think he was
Oh,
a Democrat
Breckenridge,
from
I think.
Kentucky. Yeah,
So was Breckenridge, I think.
yeah, maybe so.
All right, secession and the other president. The slave states just went totally ballistic. The slave states, remember, were the bottom, the deep South. They saw themselves as a minority in the Senate. They saw themselves with no electoral clout, and they saw the North lording it over them. And they saw slavery coming to an end, even though no one in the Republican Party ever talked about abolition in the slave states that I know of. They certainly preached against slavery in general. Between election and inauguration, there was only one topic being seriously discussed in Washington, and that was slavery. They even went so far as to propose a constitutional amendment. And the constitutional amendment was going to make slavery legal constitutionally in the United States. It did not get very far. South Carolina adopted an ordinance of secession in December, and Mississippi adopted that ordinance in January. Davis then resigned and went to Mississippi. He argued against secession at the Mississippi legislature, but his voice did not carry the weight of a number of other hot-headed politicians in Mississippi, and Mississippi adopted an ordinance of secession. I think, as I remember telling you a while ago, at this point in time, Tennessee took a vote for secession and did not choose to leave the Union. The vote was to remain in the United States at this point in time. Davis then was commissioned a Major General of Mississippi troops. He was placed in command of the state militia. His intention was to serve as a leader of the military effort in the South. However, the Confederate Convention was called in Montgomery. The Confederate States of America were formed, and they named Jefferson Davis provisional president at that convention. He was not even there. He did not have anything to do with the creation of the Confederate States of America. He did not create that nation, but he was selected to be the chief executive of the nation that others were trying to create. And then the war came. One of Lincoln's wiser decisions was not to fire the first shot after secession. Fort Sumter was a symbol of authority, of the federal authority. It was an insult to South Carolina. Lincoln was told, if you send troops, they're going to be fired upon. So he did not send troops. He did send a ship with provisions. The ship was fired upon and withdrew, and it was not hit. Davis appointed Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard to command Confederate troops in Charleston in early 1861. Davis did not make the decision to bombard Fort Sumter. The cabinet did. However, he approved the decision. The Civil War started the 15th of April. The first thing that happened was the Confederacy called for 100,000 volunteers. Lincoln then called for 75,000 volunteers to supplement the regular army that the federal government was responsible for. When he called for those volunteers, that then precipitated the secessions in Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Those states did not leave the Union until after Lincoln called for volunteers to put down what was called the rebellion. talked a little bit more about Lincoln. He took overall responsibility for selecting key commanders, especially key commanders in the East. He had a general, Winfield Scott, who was in charge of the army, but Scott was pretty much a subordinate of Lincoln in terms of choices. Lincoln initially focused his attention on those border states. Remember them? Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. He wanted no federal troops in any of those states. He wanted to take no action that might cause them to follow the 11 who are now seceded. As commander-in-chief, he had no experience as an executive, none. All of his previous experiences were in legislative arenas and legal endeavors. He had never run anything beyond the size of a law office personally. In the East, his focus was to find a general who would lead what would become the largest army in the world. His first choice, and this was Scott's first choice actually, Scott recommended that he select Robert E. Lee to lead this new army. Lee chose otherwise. So then what he had for the next 2 years was an endless series of generals trying to find one who would defeat Lee. First it was McClellan, then it was McDowell, then it was McClellan again, Joseph Hooker, John Pope, Ambrose Burnside. All of these generals were defeated by Robert E. Lee in the East. And you just cannot imagine how hard it must have been to run through all these generals and have none of them be successful. However, Union efforts in the West were successful. As I said last time, Henry and Donelson were captured pretty quickly. Then Nashville fell. Shiloh was a Northern victory, and then Corinth fell. So in the West, things were going well. And by the way, that's where Grant was. He wasn't the general-in-chief in the West, though. A general named Halleck was actually his commander. In July of 1862, Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, and you can read that. All persons held as slaves shall be henceforth and forever free. But he knew the forever was only as long as the war would last. It changed the war from a contest between armies to a contest between societies. It stunned his cabinet. They were not in favor of doing what he wanted to do. At the time, the priority was keeping the Union intact. It was not getting rid of slavery. Their main concerns were, first of all, the border states and how they were going to react. And remember, their slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. They were also concerned about how foreign countries were going to react. Although England had already abolished slavery, and I don't know what France's posture was about slavery. January 1st, 1863, it became law. Simultaneously, the victory at Gettysburg, the capture of Vicksburg, established Union control of the Mississippi and split the Confederacy in half. So by the summer of 1863, things were going well for the Union, especially in the West. And then the Union victory at Chattanooga, the outcome in the West by then was clear. Sherman then assaulted Atlanta and then later took Savannah. That would just do nothing but further split the Confederacy. So his confidence in the eventual outcome of the war by this point in time had to be very strong. Just wanted to talk a little bit about Gettysburg. Gettysburg was a Northern victory, but Meade failed to follow up on his victory. So Lincoln wrote him a very, very strong letter criticizing him severely for failing to take full advantage of a defeated Robert E. Lee. He never mailed that letter. Following the battle at Gettysburg and at the convocation of the cemetery, he delivered perhaps the greatest speech in the English language. I think everybody knows it. I personally had to learn that. I was a bad boy, I guess, in about third or fourth grade. So I had to learn the entire Gettysburg Address word for word. But it is for us the living to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have so nobly advanced, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The war was going to continue for another 18 months, and I have been asked more than once why the South did not capitulate at that point in time. The end seemed clear by late 1864. Lincoln was reelected in 1864. He defeated McClellan, by now out of the Army. McClellan was a peace candidate. Supposedly one of the main reasons that he defeated McClellan is Sherman had taken Atlanta, which showed that the war was on its last stage, and nobody wanted George McClellan as a peace candidate to replace Lincoln. I think this is a very telling picture. This is the last known photograph of Lincoln. He was 56 years old, and he looks like he's an ancient man. There's no doubt that 4 years of the Civil War and all of the other things that have happened to him aged him a great deal. Now, the Confederate War years of Davis. One of the things that he decided, and I don't think he did this alone, was that he needed to defend all Southern territory. He did not have the resources to do that, and what it did was make it vulnerable to thrusts into the West. He also created an army. There was no such thing as a Southern Army in 1861. First of all, he courted regular Army officers, starting with Robert E. Lee, but a number of other regular Army officers joined the South and joined the Confederacy. They procured weapons, some of which they actually got from armories like those up in, and I can't all of a sudden think of the right word. He organized a military structure. That didn't exist either. There was no structure at all when Davis started. At Bull Run, he had two armies. One was out in the Shenandoah and one was at Manassas. And what he did was he moved the army from the Shenandoah to Manassas to give them enough of a preponderance of forces to win the first battle of Manassas. In June, Davis assigned Robert E. Lee, by the way, at that point in time was his personal advisor. He was not in command of combat forces. Joseph P. Johnson was wounded in one of the first battles along the peninsula. He assigned Robert E. Lee to replace Joseph Johnston. He set a high priority, and this is fairly significant, on recognition of the states by England and France. They sent envoys to Europe, doing the same thing that the revolutionaries did 75 years before. I don't know if you know about the Mason and Slidell affair, but those were two Southern diplomats. They were captured by the Union Navy. They raised a political fuss. Lincoln and or his subordinates decided that holding on to them was not a good idea. They were not combatants and let them go. They both got to Europe, and they never accomplished what they set out to accomplish. Davis did not have a very good understanding of financial affairs, and neither did his Treasury Secretary. Their thinking was King Cotton. King Cotton was the primary product of the United States at that time, that King Cotton would sustain them. He also wouldn't support a squadron of blockade runners that would be under the guise of the Confederate States of America. So for the first 4 years, the blockade runners were privateers. They did not belong to a Confederate Navy. He changed that very late in the war because he considered it a private affair. And it wasn't just the blockade running that became that kind of a problem, because he did not want the railroads to be under the control of the government either. The railroads remained private affairs throughout the war. I thought you might be interested in this. How did they finance the war? Basically, what the Confederacy did was print money. They printed $1.5 billion in paper currency. They also sold bonds, and they raised some money by taxes, but primarily they funded the war with paper. The result was 9,000% inflation. Meanwhile, in the North, wealth was spread across industry and farming. War demanded 15% of the gross national product of the North. Most of their money actually came from 6% bonds, minimum of 5 years to pay out. So $1.5 billion of what it took to run the Union Army came from bonds. Second source was taxation. $600 million came from taxes. And then third, they printed some paper currency, $500 million. They also established a national bank. Up until then, there was no such thing as a national bank. States had banks. The result was an 80% inflation in the North. Davis is war leader. He made his strategic decisions or approved those that were suggested by Lee and a small circle of advisors. He knew they needed to fight on the defensive, as did George Washington. He did not want to do that. He was not comfortable fighting a defensive war. He spent most of his time, though, in and around Richmond, paying a great deal of attention to the defense of the capital. He did attempt 2 strategic offenses. He felt that, and he was part and parcel with Lee, felt that military success would shake Northern confidence and also strengthen something called a peace party there. Most historians criticize him for his strategy. Also criticize him for his selection of friends for military command. And then finally, for his neglect of the home front crisis. He did not connect with the common person at all. Relations between Davis and his Congress deteriorated. The first Congress enacted the measures that he initiated because they had no better plan. The Confederate Congress was never very effective. Not only that, to get the states to cooperate. Now remember, this is a country formed by states that left the United States because they wanted the right to do whatever they chose to do. The states were unwilling to support efforts that didn't involve their forces or their issues. And he had a great deal of trouble getting the states to supply not just men or weapons, but any other form of logistical support. It was an ongoing problem for Davis, and it had to do with how it was built to begin with. He resisted having a general-in-chief. He did not have one. He was the general-in-chief. Not until January of 1865 did that change when Lee assumed that role and the war was, for all intents and purposes, over. He made controversial strategic choices. He authorized Lee to invade the North when the Western armies were under heavy pressure. And I
Hey,
talked a
George.
little bit about that last time. Yeah,
I read that there was a vote of no confidence in Jefferson Davis and that the Confederate Congress made Lee general in chief. Is that correct?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
But by then the war was, for all
Yeah,
intents
it was
and
late in the
purposes,
war. It was in 1865, like April or something
right,
like that.
right. Davis's problems in the West were just like Lincoln's problems in the East. Albert Sidney Johnston, Beauregard, Braxton Bragg, Joseph Johnson, John Bell Hood never produced a coherent command structure. He didn't like two of those people. He didn't like Joseph Johnston and he didn't like Beauregard. So part of it was his personal friendships with people. And as a result, the West never had any kind of coherent command structure. He poorly managed his generals. We talked before about he would not relieve Braxton Bragg after all of the trouble fighting with Rosecrans. Bragg actually left on his own accord, or left the Army of Tennessee on his own accord, and he replaced him with Joseph Johnson. So what did he do? He relieved Johnson because Johnson didn't fight the way he wanted him to. He replaced him with John Bell Hood, and as a result, they lost Atlanta. He would give speeches to soldiers and to politicians, but he ignored the common people. He never made any kind of significant effort to involve the population into winning the war. In 1865, the 13th Amendment passed the House of Representatives, a la the movie Abraham Lincoln. On April, Davis escaped to Danville, Virginia. So he came from up in Richmond, heading this way. Lee was heading this way. He took the cabinet with him. This is in April. Lincoln's plan was to bring Southern citizens home as wayward children, not as traitors. He would treat the people of the South with malice towards none and charity for all. This did not happen. Davis issued his last proclamation, went south to Greensboro, North Carolina. On the 12th of April, he received Robert E. Lee's letter announcing that he had surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. The Confederate government, developed some plans to flee to Havana, Cuba. The leaders that didn't go to Havana were going to regroup across the Mississippi. And then one final act remained on Good Friday. Abraham Lincoln was martyred. As Stanton said, now he belongs to the ages. Lincoln's funeral was a train that crossed the country on the same route he had taken 4 years earlier, coming east. It was an overwhelming statement of the grief at his death in the country. Davis's last years. The Confederacy was officially dissolved the 5th of May, 1865, in a little town called Washington, Georgia. He was captured 5 days later in Georgia. He was held as a prisoner for 2 years at Fort Monroe. He was indicted for treason. However, he spent only 2 years in prison, and then he was released on bail of $100,000, which back in those days was a lot of money. It was posted by citizens of both northern and southern states, including Horace Greeley. He was never tried, and he was also never pardoned. So basically, for the rest of his life, he was on some form of, I guess, parole is what they would have called it. After his release, he took a trip around Europe Canada, and Cuba. And in 1869, they just dropped the case. I've never read exactly why they did that. By then, Johnston was president. He then became president of the Carolina Life Insurance Company in Memphis, Tennessee. He wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, which actually restored his reputation in the South. He got a very warm reception on his tour of the region in 86 and 87. In 1888, he died in New Orleans at the age of 81. His funeral, and that's what his funeral looked like in New Orleans, was one of the largest ever held in the South. The legacy of Abraham Lincoln. He preserved the Union of the United States. He resolved the problem that the founding fathers could not. He ended slavery. And I don't think we should take that as a small thing, because slavery wasn't about to die of its own accord. History has placed Lincoln in the highest pantheon, our greatest president. His leadership during the war redefined the role of the executive branch of the government. Thousands of books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, about his accomplishments, about his leadership, and about his humanity. It's really, I have on my bookshelf about 20 different books about Lincoln, and they're all really very different. People have continued to be fascinated by this man. The statue in the Lincoln Memorial represents what he became, which is a man larger than life, who, as Stanton said, belongs to the ages. Meanwhile, the legacy of Jefferson Davis. History has not been kind to him. He accepted a position he did not want, fought a war he was convinced was a bad idea, and then was personally blamed for many of its failures. Few biographies are available on Jefferson Davis today. I looked this up, and I could only find about 15 that have been written about Jefferson Davis in the last 150 years. He was a successful planter. He was a notable politician. He was one of America's esteemed political leaders. There were people who thought he might become president of the United States. But as Lee was deified by the lost cause, Davis was revered by the lost cause. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the lost cause before I let you go, for his suffering. Neither his words nor his actions are well remembered today. Epilogue. How many of you know about the myth of the lost cause? Why the South fought the Civil War and why the North won? The Vice President of the Confederacy acknowledged in his first book, which was written in 1868, that slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederacy. They changed their mind pretty quickly. He later said that the war was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. He became an ardent defender of the lost cause myth. The lost cause was a movement to reconcile the traditional white society of the South to its defeat. It portrays their cause as noble. Confederate leaders were examples of chivalry, and all the North was money-grubbing, manufacturing dolts. To the lost causer, the defense of states' rights, rather than the preservation of slavery, was what led to secession. It was, in their mind, a justifiable response to Northern aggression against the Southern way of life. Now, I neither affirm or discredit the lost cause, and I will tell you honestly, when I was a young man, I listened to that, especially from my father, and I bought it pretty much hook, line, and sinker. Robert E. Lee was the greatest man who ever lived. Grant and Lincoln, neither had a tenth of the character and the nobility of Lee and Jackson and all the rest of them. So I bought it when I was young. I have since changed my mind. This program might help you draw your own conclusions. So do you have any questions? Is there anybody there?
George,
What?
Jefferson Davis didn't want to be involved, it seemed. I mean, you know, his gut reaction was I mean, if you're not, it's just like a salesman. If you don't believe in your product, you can't really sell it. And he seemed like he just wasn't into it at all. Was there anyone else that could have served or done a better job? I mean, I don't want to be against Jefferson Davis, but it seemed like to me he didn't have the heart.
Real rabid secessionist, a man named Rhett, several people from South Carolina, a couple from Alabama and Mississippi, did not have the national stature that Davis had. So that's why they chose him.
But he wanted a military command.
Yes, he did. He wanted to be a soldier. That's all he wanted.
He didn't want to be a politician.
No, he did not. And he wasn't a very good politician. That's the fairest way to look at it.
Yeah. Wasn't a good commander either.
Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln.
So, thanks,
Right.
George. Good
Okay.
program.
It was very excellent. I like that when we have a chance, you said there was a book about Lincoln with all these news articles. I would love to borrow it
It's
from you.
not just about Lincoln, Norm. It's called the 4 years of the Civil War. And someone took and made extracts from the Atlanta newspaper of once a week, all of the major articles in the newspaper for that week. And it's the entire war.
Wow, that's really great.
It really isn't it. And anybody who'd like to read it, you're welcome to it. It's not light reading, but it's interesting to kind of show you what was going on at given points in time, what they knew and what they didn't know. America was doing its very best to self-destruct.
Okay, we may have one more program next week. We'll take off for Thanksgiving for sure.
Okay.
Let me stop this recording.